A millionaire finds a lost child at the beach. When he rescues her, he discovers a surprise. The sky, in vibrant shades of gold and orange, seemed to pulsate in harmony with the waves breaking gently on the sand. The sound of the sea was a constant, almost hypnotic whisper, and the salty breeze caressed Alexander Whitmore's face as he walked barefoot along the beach. Every grain of sand beneath his feet felt heavy, as if the earth itself recognized the burden he carried in his heart. This place was more than a refuge. It was a treasure chest of memories. The beach held the most precious moments of his adolescence, when he and Isabel Carter spent entire afternoons there, believing that the world was theirs. The texture of the stones, the smell of seaweed brought in by the tide, even the distant sound of seagulls seemed to conspire to bring her back to her mind. Isabel, with her laugh as light as a summer breeze, with her eyes that sparkled like the ocean itself. He could almost feel the touch of her hand in his, a ghost of a time he had never been able to leave behind. Alexander clenched his hands, feeling his fingers become damp with sweat, even in the cold wind. He was there to try and find clarity, but with every step the confusion inside him grew. Victoria Hart, his fiancée, was an incredible woman. Admirable, intelligent, kind and charming. Any man would be lucky to have her by his side. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't feel what he felt for Isabel. There was no spark, no overwhelming warmth that true love brings. He remembered that morning when Victoria had burst into the room with a sketch of the wedding decorations. "Alex, look at this," she said, her eyes shining like the reflection of the sun on water. "I thought of shades of gold and white. Elegant, don't you think?" Alexander forced a smile. "It's perfect, Vic." Her voice sounded distant even to him. She was so excited that she didn't seem to notice the shadow in his eyes. And why would she? Victoria was investing everything in this wedding. He knew she really loved him, and that certainty made the anguish inside him grow even more. The wind blew harder, kicking up particles of sand that whipped his legs. Alexander stopped walking and looked towards the horizon, where the golden sky met the dark sea. The cold, rough texture of the sand began to feel like a mirror of the sensation in his chest, a mixture of comfort and pain. He sat down on the sand, allowing the wind to ruffle his hair and the chill of the evening to begin to penetrate his skin. He closed his eyes and let the sounds around him envelop him, the breaking waves, the sizzle of the wind, the occasional sound of a seagull calling in the distance. Nature seemed to want to calm him down, but his heart was still restless. As much as he tried to focus on the future he was building with Victoria, his heart kept returning to Isabel. How would she be now? Was she still thinking about him, even for a brief moment? He could clearly see her smile, hear her soft voice telling him that he was everything she wanted. But Isabel had left him, disappeared without explanation, leaving a void that Victoria, no matter how good she was, could never fill. He picked up a rounded stone and ran his fingers over its cold, smooth surface before throwing it into the sea with force. The stone cut through the water in one swift movement before disappearing. He wished his thoughts could dissipate in the same way. His mother, Evelyn Whitmore, had always been clear about what she expected of him. "You have a legacy to protect, Alexander. Someone like Victoria is ideal. She understands what it means to be part of a family like ours." Her words echoed in his mind. Victoria was perfect on paper, but as Alexander stared at the darkening horizon, he knew that perfection wasn't enough. True love couldn't be forced, and he couldn't pretend anymore. The sky was now dotted with stars, and darkness was beginning to cover the beach. Alexander remained seated, his hands resting on the cold sand, his eyes fixed on the waves that came and went like the conflicting thoughts in his mind. The place, with all its serene beauty, seemed to conspire to make him confront a truth he had been trying to ignore. He was engaged to a wonderful woman, but his heart still belonged to someone he hadn't seen for years. And there, on that beach that was a piece of his past, Alexander knew he couldn't go on living a lie. The sound of crying interrupted the steady rhythm of the waves, a sad melody that mingled with the wind. Alexander Whitmore, absorbed in his thoughts, turned his head quickly towards the sound. It was a child for sure. He narrowed his eyes, but dusk was beginning to swallow up the daylight, making it difficult to see far ahead. He took a few steps, first hesitantly, then more steadily, following the sound that seemed to come from near the line where the waves broke gently on the sand. Finally, he saw a small figure crouching, almost cowering, trembling and sobbing. His heart raced, a mixture of concern and urgency driving him on. "Hey, are you all right?" Alexander asked as he approached, trying not to frighten her. The child raised her face, and Alexander stopped, feeling a twinge in his chest. The girl was about 6 years old, with big, tear-filled eyes that reflected the brightness of the stars that were beginning to appear. Her brown hair was messy, sticking to her face because of the humidity, and her expression was one of pure desperation. I can't find my mommy," she said in a tone that almost broke Alexander's heart. He knelt down on the sand, ignoring the cold that was starting to creep up his legs. He tried to look as calm as possible, even though he knew that the girl's anguish was beginning to infect him. "Hey, it's okay, don't worry, I'll help you find your mum. What's your name?" "Sophia," the girl replied between sobs, wiping her eyes with the back of her small hands. "Sophia, what a beautiful name. My name is Alexander. You know what we're going to do, Sophia? We're going to look for your mother together. I promise we'll find her." Sophia looked at him, still hesitant, but his voice seemed to have touched something in her little heart, because she nodded slowly. Alexander took off his shirt and put it around the girl's shoulders, protecting her from the cold wind blowing off the sea. "Do you remember where you last saw your mother?" Sophia shook her head negatively, her face twisted in frustration and fear. "I was playing with my bucket, and then I looked, and she wasn't there." Alexander felt a lump in his throat. He knew there was no time to lose. Night was falling and the temperature was beginning to drop. "It's all right, little one. Sometimes moms get a little distracted, but I bet she's already looking for you." He held her hand, feeling the fragility of those small fingers in his palm. They started walking along the beach, Alexander paying attention to every detail around him. Faces, clothes, groups of people. But with every minute that passed without success, his concern grew. To distract Sophia, Alexander told her stories about when he was a child and once got lost. The girl sniffled, but seemed to calm down when she heard his voice. "My mother was so worried that when she found me, she squeezed me so tightly that I thought I was going to run out of air," he said, smiling. Sophia laughed softly, and Alexander felt a small wave of relief, but there was still a constant tension in his chest, as if time was against them. After almost half an hour of searching, Alexander spotted a woman running frantically across the sand, shouting a name. "Sophia!" The little girl let go of his hand and shot off in the direction of the voice, her little legs seeming to fly across the sand. "Mommy!" Alexander stopped, relieved to see that the girl was safe. He watched as the woman knelt on the sand, wrapping Sophia in a tight embrace. The wind blew her brown hair, hiding part of her face, but there was something about her that seemed strangely familiar. He took a few steps closer, and when the woman raised her face to thank him, the impact was so strong that Alexander felt the ground wobble beneath his feet. His heart stopped for a moment, and he went still, unable to process what he was seeing. It was Isabel, the woman he had loved deeply, the woman he had lost and could never forget. Their eyes met, and Alexander saw the shock reflected in her face too. Time seemed to freeze as he tried to understand the torrent of emotions that surged inside him. Surprise, nostalgia, joy, and an old pain that had never been completely healed. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Isabel seemed so different, and at the same time so the same. There was something tired in her gaze, but the warmth and sweetness he remembered were still there. "Alexander," she said, her voice a whisper that hit him like a wave. The sound of his name coming from her lips brought back a flood of memories. He needed a moment to collect himself before answering, his voice coming out huskier than he had intended. "Isabel." And just like that, the past he had spent years trying to overcome was there, right in front of him, holding a child who stared at him curiously, as if sensing that something very important was happening. Isabel's eyes were still watery as she held Sophia's face, examining it from top to bottom, as if to make sure there wasn't even a scratch. Her voice was a mixture of relief and emotion as she spoke. "Are you all right, my little one? I was so worried." Isabel stroked her daughter's hair, and Sophia responded with a tight hug, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. Alexander watched the scene in silence, struggling to take it all in. The Isabel he had known years ago seemed different now, not just physically, but in essence. There was a strength in her gestures, as if the years had shaped someone more resilient, but also a subtle sadness in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. Finally, Isabel looked up and met Alexander's eyes again. He could see the whirlwind of emotions in her, surprise, gratitude, and something else, something indefinable, that he didn't know was just a reflection of his own heart. "Alexander, I don't even know how to thank you." Her voice came out shaky but full of sincerity. "I was only distracted for an instant, a second, and the next thing I knew, she wasn't there anymore." Her breathing became ragged, as if the memory of that moment was still suffocating her. Alexander took a step forward, driven by the impulse to reassure her. "Isabel, everything is fine now. Sophia is safe. That's all that matters." His voice was calm, but he felt the weight of every word, as if he was trying to convince her and himself that this encounter wasn't just a coincidence. Sophia looked at him over Isabel's shoulder, her eyes curious and trusting. She no longer looked scared, but there was a stillness about her that Alexander couldn't ignore. He smiled at the girl, trying to convey the same reassurance as before. Isabel sighed deeply, and still holding her daughter's hand, straightened her shoulders. There was something dignified about her gesture, something Alexander recognized immediately. She didn't want to appear vulnerable, even after everything that had just happened. "I really don't know how to thank you, Alexander," she repeated, the sincerity in her voice making his heart race. "I was desperate. I didn't know what to do. I'd been all over this beach. I'd spoken to so many people, and no one had seen my daughter." He shook his head, as if to dismiss the need to thank me. "You don't have to thank me, Isabel. I just did what anyone would do." She smiled a little. After a moment of silence, he looked around, searching for some sign that would explain why Isabel was there, alone, with Sophia. "Are you alone?" The question slipped out almost automatically, but his tone was careful. He didn't want to seem intrusive, but curiosity was evident on his face. Isabel hesitated for a moment. Her hand squeezed Sophia's a little tighter before she answered. "Yes, I'm alone." Her eyes met his again, and she added, almost in a whisper, "It's just the two of us now." Alexander felt a mixture of relief and unease at the answer. He didn't know what had happened in her life since they had separated, but he knew he had to find out. He couldn't let this reunion end there with a goodbye on the sand. "Isabel, can I take you home?" he asked carefully, trying not to sound pushy. "It's getting late, and I wouldn't feel right letting you go back alone." Isabel blinked, surprised by the offer. For a moment it looked like she was considering refusing, but then her shoulders relaxed a little. Perhaps it was tiredness or relief at having found Sophia, but she nodded slowly. "I'd really appreciate it. I don't live far, but—" She looked at Sophia, whose eyes were now heavy with sleep. "It would be easier that way." "Good." Alexander tried to hide how anxious his immediate response sounded, but he felt his heart racing at the prospect of spending more time with them, especially Isabel. As they walked towards the car, he glanced at Isabel, trying to understand who she was now. He saw in her the marks of a life that seemed to have been difficult, but he also saw the strength she had always had, now even more evident. She kept holding Sophia's hand, as if she never wanted to let go. Alexander opened the car door for them, and once they were settled, started the engine and drove slowly, absorbing the comfortable silence that had settled in. When they arrived at Isabel's house, he parked in front of a small, cozy apartment building. "Thank you, Alexander." Her voice cut through the silence, and he turned to face her. "I really mean it." He hesitated for a moment, but then asked with a sincerity he couldn't hide, "Isabel, can we see each other again?" She was silent for a moment, her eyes darkening with thoughts he couldn't reach. But when she finally answered, her voice had a soft touch of hope. "I think so. I'll give you my number and you call me. Let's talk. We haven't seen each other for so long. It's going to be a lot of stories to tell." And in that instant, Alexander knew that fate had given him a second chance, and he had no intention of wasting it. The morning was bright, with the sun filtering its soft light through the windows of the small cafe where Alexander and Isabel had arranged to meet. It was a discreet place away from the busy city center, perfect for a conversation that they both knew would be full of memories, revelations, and perhaps a little pain. Alexander arrived early, something that was unusual in his meticulously planned routine. He sat by the window, watching the cars passing by on the street, and trying to organize the thoughts that, since the night before, had given him no rest. The sound of the door opening brought his attention back, and there she was. Isabel entered with a slight hesitation in her step, but her steady gaze met Alexander's almost immediately. She was dressed simply, but there was a natural elegance in the way she walked. For him, it was as if the years had only accentuated the essence of the woman he had always loved. "Isabel," he said, rising to greet her. His voice came out softer than he had expected, almost reverent. "Alexander." She smiled slightly, a smile that seemed to carry both joy and a certain melancholy. He pulled out a chair for her, and Isabel thanked him with a nod before sitting down. There was a moment of silence between them, not uncomfortable but full of meaning. Alexander felt his heart race as he realized that this encounter, something so simple, meant more than any other moment in his recent life. "Thank you for calling me," began Isabel, her fingers absent-mindedly touching the rim of the cup the waiter had just brought. "After everything, I thought. Well, that would be the end of it." Alexander leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on hers. "Isabel, I've waited so long to see you again. Now that I've found you, I don't want you to disappear from my life again." She looked away for a moment, stirring her coffee with her spoon. "Alexander, a lot has changed. I've changed, and so have I," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "But I don't think that matters now. What matters is that we're here." Isabel stared at him, her eyes darkening with the memory of simpler times. She knew the time had come to speak. She took a sip of coffee before beginning. "When we parted, it was as if the ground had disappeared from my feet." Her voice was calm, but charged with emotion. "After my parents divorced, things became very difficult. My mother, she tried to cope, but it was too much. So I found myself alone trying to find my place." Alexander listened in silence, absorbing every word. He had never known what had happened to Isabel after she had disappeared from his life. "I met Sophia's father not long after." Isabel paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "At first he seemed like the solution to all my problems. He was charming, attentive, but I soon realized that it was all just a facade. He drank a lot, and the drink turned him into someone I hardly recognized." Alexander felt his chest tighten as he heard those words. The thought of Isabel going through something so difficult was unbearable. "So," he asked softly, encouraging her to continue, "I found out I was pregnant, and for a brief moment I thought that would change everything, that he would change, but I was wrong. He got even worse, until one day he left. Sophia was still a baby, and I was alone, not knowing what to do." There was a long silence after those words. Alexander watched the way Isabel looked at the cup, as if the small object could carry the weight of her memories. "Did you have to deal with all this alone?" Alexander's voice was full of disbelief and sadness. "I did." Isabel shrugged, trying to look indifferent, but he could see the pain still alive in her eyes. "But you learned to survive. I had no choice. Sophia needed me." Alexander took a deep breath, feeling his admiration for her grow even more. Isabel wasn't just the woman he had loved. She was someone extraordinary, who had faced challenges he couldn't even imagine. "Isabel, you don't deserve to go through this alone. You don't deserve never to have gone through it." She smiled a small, tired smile. "Don't worry about me, Alexander. I'm fine, or at least I'm learning to be." He hesitated for a moment, trying to find the right words. Finally, he decided that he couldn't hide his feelings any longer. "I've never forgotten you, Isabel." His words came out low, but full of intensity. "I tried to move on. I tried to do what my family expected of me, but you were always here." He touched his chest, where his heart was beating fast. "Always." Isabel stared at him, surprised by his confession. For a moment, it seemed as if she didn't know what to say. But then, gently, she reached out and placed her hand over his. "I've never forgotten you either, Alexander." The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was full of possibilities, of a future that they were both beginning to glimpse, even if it was still uncertain. The cozy atmosphere of the cafe, with the slight buzz of conversation in the background and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, seemed a cruel contrast to the storm brewing inside Alexander. He watched Isabel, who was now relaxing a little more in her chair, taking small sips from her cup. Everything seemed so natural, so right. And at the same time, everything was terribly wrong. Alexander knew he needed to speak, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders, making it difficult even to breathe. Still, he couldn't put it off any longer. "Isabel," he began, his voice low and cautious, but enough to capture her attention. She raised her eyes, curious and attentive. There was something about her, an openness, as if she was ready to listen to anything he had to say. It made him feel the weight of what was to follow all the more. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have said before, but I didn't know how." The subtle smile on Isabel's face disappeared, giving way to an expression of caution. "What is it, Alexander?" Alexander hesitated for a moment, but he knew he couldn't back down. He had to be honest, even if it risked the small thread of hope that had begun to emerge between them. "I'm engaged." He said the words with deliberate clarity, as if to ensure that she heard them as directly as possible. For a moment, Isabel's face remained impassive, but her eyes couldn't hide her surprise, and something deeper, perhaps a twinge of pain. "Fiancé?" she repeated, her voice controlled but slightly lower. "Yes," he confirmed, trying to keep his tone calm, even though he could feel his heart racing. "Her name is Victoria. She's incredible, smart, kind, everything any man could want." "And why don't you seem happy?" Isabel asked bluntly, with a calm that contrasted with the obvious tension in the air. Alexander looked away for a moment, running his hand through his hair, a gesture he always made when he was nervous. "Because I don't love her. Not as I should. Not like—" He stopped, but Isabel knew exactly how he intended to finish that sentence. Her expression remained neutral, but he could see the internal struggle in her eyes. "So, why did you accept?" she asked, her voice low, but with an intensity that made him feel a tightness in his chest. Alexander took a deep breath, trying to find the right words to explain something that he himself found difficult to justify. "Because that's what my family expects of me, my mother especially. Evelyn has always had a very clear vision of what my life should be. Marrying Victoria is just another piece of that plan, and since Victoria is a nice person, I just went along with it." Isabel crossed her arms, a gesture that showed more bewilderment than judgment. "And what about you? Where do you fit into this plan? What do you want, Alexander?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. Her question disarmed him. It was so simple, yet so devastating. He had never allowed anyone to confront him like this, let alone so directly. Finally, he looked up at her. "I want you." His voice came out in a whisper, but the impact was as strong as a scream. "Isabel, I've always wanted you." She blinked, surprised, and for a moment he thought he had gone too far. But then she took a deep breath, and her expression softened. "Alexander, this isn't fair to Victoria, or to me." Her voice was firm, but there was a touch of sadness in it. "I know," he nodded, his voice breaking, "but I'm trying to find a way to do this without hurting anyone. Victoria doesn't deserve this. She's a good person, someone who deserves more than I can give." Isabel leaned back, crossing her arms. It was clear that she was struggling with conflicting emotions. "You need to sort this out, Alexander." Her voice was almost a whisper now. "Before you hurt even more people." He nodded again, feeling the weight of her words. He knew Isabel was right, but he also knew that he couldn't just leave everything as it was, not after meeting her again. "I just need a little time," he said, his voice full of urgency. "Isabel, I don't want to lose you again." She looked at him longingly, and the silence between them seemed fraught with possibility and uncertainty. Finally she spoke, her voice soft. "Alexander, I can't wait for you forever." Her answer hit him hard, but he knew that as painful as it was exactly what he needed to hear. When Alexander and Isabel said goodbye in the cafeteria, it was a strange moment, full of unspoken emotions. He followed her to the door, watching her walk away with hesitant but determined steps. Even after she had disappeared from sight, Alexander remained still, as if anchored in that instant, unable to move on. The truth was that he didn't want to let her go again, but he also knew that he couldn't offer her anything while his life was entangled in other people's commitments and expectations. That night, he couldn't sleep. The memory of Isabel and the intensity of what he had felt during that conversation raged through his mind like a storm. It wasn't just the past resurfacing. It was something alive and pulsating, a connection that he had thought was lost, but which now seemed stronger than ever. With his phone in hand, he hesitated for several minutes before deciding to send a simple message. "I hope you got home okay. I'd like to see you again." The reply came a few minutes later. "I'm fine, thanks. We can talk another day." Over the next few days, Alexander and Isabel began to speak frequently. He would call her at night, using any pretext to hear her voice. The conversation always began with trivial questions. How was the day? Was Sophia all right? But soon evolved into something deeper. Isabel would talk about the small daily achievements with Sophia, the challenges of raising a daughter on her own, and sometimes about memories of simpler times. Alexander, for his part, shared the doubts that consumed him, the pressure to be who his family expected him to be, and the constant feeling that he was living a life that wasn't really his. "It's good to talk to you," he said one evening as he walked through the empty office of his home, trying not to sound as vulnerable as he felt. "It's good to talk to you too, Alexander," Isabel replied, her voice soft on the other end of the line. "But you know that doesn't change things, right? As long as you don't know what you really want, I can't wait for something that might never happen." Alexander remained silent, feeling the weight of those words. He knew Isabel was right, but he couldn't help wanting to be close to her. That's when they started meeting, always in public places, in parks or squares, where Sophia could play freely while they talked. Sophia, with her contagious energy, seemed to light up those meetings, and Alexander soon realized that being with them was the only thing that really made sense in his life. The three of them together formed an unexpected dynamic. Alexander played with Sophia, pushing her on the swing or helping her build sandcastles on the playground, while Isabel watched, smiling, but always with an obvious reserve in her eyes. She didn't want to raise any false hopes, and Alexander felt it as an invisible barrier between them. Still, those moments seemed perfect, even if they were fleeting. At home, however, things were starting to fall apart. Victoria was no fool. She noticed the growing distance between them, Alexander's frequent excuses for not taking part in the wedding preparations, and the lost look he displayed when he thought she wasn't looking. The tension between them was palpable, but Victoria hesitated to confront him directly, fearing what she might hear. Finally, one evening, after yet another meeting with the wedding planner, in which Alexander had barely said a word, Victoria couldn't hold it in any longer. "Alexander, can we talk?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of frustration and concern. He looked at her, realizing for the first time in weeks how tired Victoria looked. There was something in her gaze that made him feel a twinge of guilt, but he knew he couldn't keep putting off the inevitable. "Of course, shall we have dinner tomorrow? Somewhere quiet, just the two of us. We need to talk," he replied, trying to sound calmer than he felt. Victoria nodded in agreement, but the silence that followed was suffocating. Alexander knew that dinner would be a decisive moment, and this left him in a constant state of nervousness until the next day. When they arrived at the restaurant, Alexander chose a table in a secluded corner, away from the hubbub of other conversations. He ordered wine but realized that he was barely touching the glass as Victoria watched him, waiting for him to start. "Victoria," he finally spoke after a long silence, "you know that I admire you deeply. You're an incredible woman, and anyone would be lucky to have you by their side. But you don't love me," interrupted Victoria, her voice firm, but with a tremor that revealed the pain behind her words. Alexander looked up at her, surprised by her frankness, but also relieved that he didn't have to dance around the truth. "Not in the way you deserve," he replied, his voice laden with sincerity. "I tried, Victoria. I tried to do everything right, to follow what was expected of me, but that's not fair on you, or to me." Victoria looked away, and Alexander saw the tears she was trying to hold back. He knew he was hurting her, but he also knew that prolonging this would only make it worse. "I wish I could be the man you deserve, but I'm not, and I can't go on like this." Victoria took a deep breath, struggling to pull herself together before speaking. "You still love someone else, don't you?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Alexander didn't answer immediately, but the silence was answer enough. Victoria got up from the table abruptly, and her chair scraped on the floor, attracting the attention of a few people around her. Her eyes were watery, but there was something else in her expression, dignity mixed with pain. Alexander watched her in silence, feeling the crushing weight of his own decisions. Your silence is an answer." Her words came out firm, but he could hear the tremor in her voice. She picked up her bag and left the restaurant without looking back, but Alexander knew those tears were for him. He sat there for a few minutes, staring at the void Victoria had left, feeling torn inside. He knew he had no choice. She didn't deserve this, but he couldn't go on living a lie either. After paying the bill, Alexander left the restaurant, but the night with its cool, silent air didn't bring the relief he had hoped for. Victoria's words echoed in his mind, and he knew that although he had done the right thing, there was still a lot to face. Back in his apartment, he sat down at the table and began to write a message to Victoria's family. His hands trembled as he typed the words, each loaded with regret and sincerity. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Hart, I'm so sorry for hurting Victoria. She's an incredible person, and I know that the admiration I have for her will never be enough to justify what happened. But the truth is that it wouldn't be fair to continue with this marriage without the certainty that I could make her as happy as she deserves. I accept all the responsibility and pain I have caused you. I hope that one day you can forgive me." After sending the message, Alexander felt some of the weight lift from his shoulders, but he knew that the biggest challenge was yet to come. The next morning, he was greeted at Whitmore Manor with cutting glances from his mother, Evelyn. She already knew everything, and her indignation was evident. Sitting in the large living room with her impeccable posture and a cup of tea in her hands, Evelyn wasted no time in expressing her fury. "Alexander Whitmore, you have just tarnished our family name irreparably," she exclaimed, her voice echoing off the walls of the room. "How could you do this? Cancel such a perfect wedding. Victoria is an extraordinary woman, and you've publicly humiliated her." Alexander remained calm even though he felt his blood boiling. "Mom, I couldn't go on with something that wasn't true. I didn't love Victoria the way she deserved. And if I had gone through with it, it would have been worse for all of us." "Worse?" Evelyn practically shouted, her aristocratic composure beginning to crumble. "There's nothing worse than what you've done. You threw away a bright future with Victoria because of what? A whim from the past. Don't tell me this has anything to do with Isabel Carter." The name of Isabel on his mother's lips made Alexander take a deep breath, controlling himself not to respond impulsively. "My life isn't a chessboard where you move the pieces, Mum. I've made a decision, and honestly, I'm not going to discuss it with you." Evelyn was silent for a moment, but her piercing eyes said more than any words. Over the next few days, Alexander kept himself busy sorting out the practicalities of cancelling the wedding. He dealt with lawyers, cancelled contracts, and sent messages to the people closest to him explaining his decision. During this time, he avoided looking for Isabel. He knew he needed time to process everything before taking the next step. Still, he couldn't get her out of his mind. He sent Isabel messages from time to time, short and to the point, to let her know that he was dealing with everything. "I'm sorting out what I need to, but I think about you every day," was one of them. Isabel responded kindly, but kept a certain distance, knowing that Alexander needed space. In a moment of introspection, Alexander opened his social networks and hesitantly searched for Victoria's profile. He found recent photos of her on a trip with friends. In all the pictures, she was smiling, surrounded by beautiful places and stunning landscapes. Although he knew that not all the photos reflected reality, seeing Victoria moving on brought a relief he hadn't expected. It was time to take the next step. That evening, he plucked up the courage and drove to Isabel's house. The route seemed familiar, as if he had driven it 1,000 times in his mind. When he arrived, he sat in the car for a moment, staring at the light coming from the living room window. He got out of the car, walking towards the door with determined steps, but feeling his heart beat like never before. He knocked on the door and waited. When Isabel opened, her gaze reflected surprise, but also a softness he hadn't seen for a long time. "Alexander," she said, crossing her arms, but not defensively, but as if trying to contain an emotion that was threatening to overflow. "Isabel, I needed to see you. I couldn't wait any longer." She looked at him for a moment, evaluating every word, every expression. Finally, she opened the door wider, inviting him in. When Isabel closed the door, Alexander acted on impulse. He stepped forward and wrapped her in a firm but tender embrace. Isabel, surprised at first, hesitated for a brief moment before relaxing in his arms. Then something magical happened. They stood there, motionless, as if time had stopped. Alexander felt the soft scent of her hair and the delicate texture of her back under the fabric of her dress, while Isabel closed her eyes, allowing herself to get lost in that instant. It was as if all the years of separation, all the doubts and fears had disappeared. Only that moment mattered. Isabel rested her head on Alexander's shoulder, and he held her a little tighter, as if he feared she would disappear if he let go. "I've missed you so much," he whispered, his voice hoarse, almost muffled by the silence that surrounded them. Isabel opened her eyes slowly, pulling away just enough to look at him. There were discreet tears in her eyes, but she was smiling, a smile that carried the emotion of years of longing. "I've missed you too, Alexander. More than you know." They stood there for a few more seconds, savoring the closeness they had both craved for so long, before Isabel took his hand and led him gently into the room. "Come, sit down. I want to hear what you have to say," she said, with a warmth in her voice that made Alexander's heart race. He made his way to the sofa, where they sat side by side but still close, as if neither of them wanted to break that newly reborn connection. Alexander took a deep breath, trying to organize his swirling thoughts. "Isabel, being here with you it's everything I've wanted since the moment I saw you on the beach." He turned to her, taking her hands between his. "I need to tell you something that may already be obvious, but that I want you to hear from me." She tilted her head slightly, the smile still present, but there was an expectation shining in her eyes. "Say it, Alexander." He squeezed her hands lightly, looking directly into her eyes. "I love you, Isabel. I've always loved you, even when we were far apart, even when life pushed me in other directions. You were always the woman I loved, the only one I wanted by my side." Isabel felt her heart race. She knew deep down that he still loved her, but hearing those words directly from him made her chest fill with such intense happiness that she could hardly contain it. "Alexander," she began, but he continued as if he couldn't stop. "And it's not just you. It's Sophia, too. Ever since I met her, I've felt something inexplicable, a connection so strong. I want to be with you, Isabel. I want to be part of your lives, to build something together." Isabel's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of joy. She brought one of her hands to his face, touching him with a softness that made Alexander close his eyes for a moment, savoring the caress. "I love you too, Alexander. I always have. No matter what has happened, no matter how much time has passed, my heart has always been yours." Alexander felt his heart soar, as if her every word was a melody he had been waiting to hear for years. He didn't say another word. Instead, he leaned in gently, and Isabel did the same. When their lips met, it was as if the world around them disappeared. The kiss was tender and passionate, filled with everything they had held in for so long: love, longing, and hope. They parted slowly, their faces still close, both smiling as if they had found something they didn't even know they were missing. Isabel then stood up, still holding his hand, and said with a slight laugh, "Let's drink to that. I've got some wine in the kitchen." Alexander followed her, the smile on his face reflecting the happiness that was now overflowing in his heart. The sun was shining high above, illuminating the park where Alexander, Isabel, and Sophia were strolling together. It was an ordinary day for any observer, but for them, every moment carried a special meaning. Alexander pushed Sophia on a swing, while she let out giggles that echoed like music. Isabel watched the scene with a serene smile, sitting on a nearby bench. Their life had transformed so naturally that it seemed like a dream. After their reunion at Isabel's house, their days became lighter. Alexander finally found the freedom he had been looking for, not just to love Isabel, but to be who he really was. He made the decision to break away from his mother Evelyn's expectations and build his own happiness, even though it required difficult conversations and many changes. The relationship with Evelyn didn't end abruptly. Alexander confronted her calmly and firmly, making it clear that he would no longer follow the path she had laid out for him. Evelyn, proud and used to being obeyed, tried to use every possible argument, but Alexander stood his ground. "Mother, my life is not a reflection of your expectations, it is mine, and I choose Isabel and Sophia, because with them I have found what it means to really live." The silence that followed was heavy, but Alexander's mother realized that he wouldn't back down. Although reluctant, she finally gave in. With that chapter closed, Alexander began to devote his days to Isabel and Sophia. Casual encounters became a loving routine, and the trio formed a harmony so natural that it seemed as if it had always existed. With every walk, every shared meal, every simple moment, their lives seemed to blossom. One morning, Alexander decided to do something special. He had spent the night thinking about how to thank Isabel for never losing faith in their love, even in the most difficult times. When Sophia left for school, he showed up at Isabel's house with a mischievous smile and a bouquet of flowers in his hand. "What's that?" she asked, surprised and laughing when she saw him at the door. "I thought we deserved our own day. Sophia is at school, and the two of us have never had a moment to celebrate as we should." Isabel picked up the bouquet and sniffed the flowers before replying, "You're right. Where are we going?" Alexander took her to a winery outside the city, where they spent the day tasting wine, walking among the vineyards and laughing like old times. The scenery, with its golden hills and endless blue sky, seemed the perfect reflection of how they felt. At the end of the day, as the sun was setting in shades of orange and purple, Alexander took Isabel's hand and pulled her close. "Isabel, I need to tell you something." She smiled, her eyes shining in the evening light. "I always need to hear something from you, Alexander." He laughed softly, but his tone became more serious as he continued. "You and Sophia have changed my life. You've given me a purpose that I didn't even know I needed. I know that life won't always be easy, but I want to be by your side in every moment, the good ones and the challenging ones." Isabel felt her eyes fill with tears, but Alexander wasn't finished yet. He took a small velvet box out of his pocket and opened it, revealing a simple but incredibly beautiful ring. "Isabel Carter, will you marry me?" She laughed, surprised and thrilled at the same time, covering her mouth with her hands before answering. "Alexander Whitmore, of course I will." They kissed as the sun disappeared completely over the horizon, sealing a promise that they both knew was unbreakable. When they returned home, Sophia welcomed them with her usual energy, but noticed a different gleam in her mother's and Alexander's eyes. He took the little girl in his arms and with a smile said, "I think we're officially a family now." The months that followed were full of preparations, but not the kind that involve haste or perfection. Isabel and Alexander decided that the wedding would be simple, with only the people closest to them. Everything was planned lightly, and the focus was on celebrating the love and life they had rebuilt. On the big day, held in a flowery garden, Sophia was responsible for carrying the rings down the aisle, drawing smiles from everyone present. Alexander, his eyes fixed on Isabel, could hardly believe his luck. As the sun shone on the flower garden where the ceremony was taking place, an unexpected presence stood out among the guests. Evelyn Whitmore. Dressed in her usual elegance, but with an expression that showed something new, a mixture of nostalgia and acceptance, she was sitting in the front row, watching every moment carefully. When Isabel appeared in the aisle towards the altar, with a bright smile and a happiness that seemed to overflow, Evelyn couldn't help but let her eyes water. She looked at her son, Alexander, and saw something she hadn't seen for years: real peace. He was radiant, as if the weight he had carried for so long had finally disappeared. The moment when Alexander and Isabel exchanged vows was the pinnacle for Evelyn. Listening to her son declare his love in simple but emotionally charged words, she finally understood what she hadn't been able to accept before. It wasn't about traditions, status, or keeping the family name. It was about happiness. And in that instant, it became clear that Isabel and Sophia were the reason Alexander was who he was meant to be, a complete and genuinely happy man. At the end of the ceremony, Evelyn stood up and walked over to them. Alexander saw her approaching, felt a moment of tension, but was taken aback when she held his hands and looked directly into his eyes. "Alexander," she began, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "It took me a long time to understand. Maybe it was selfishness or pride, but now I know that what matters is that you're happy. And seeing you here with Isabel and Sophia, I can say that I've never seen you so fulfilled." Alexander felt his chest warm. That was all he wanted to hear. Evelyn then turned to Isabel, who was watching the scene with a mixture of surprise and emotion. "Isabel, thank you for bringing this into my son's life. And Sophia. Well, she's already a Whitmore at heart, isn't she?" The smile Isabel gave was as sincere as it was relieved. Evelyn, with a delicate gesture, hugged her, something Alexander would never have imagined seeing. The barrier separating the two had finally fallen. Sophia, who was standing next to Isabel, watching everything with her big, curious eyes, was taken by surprise when Evelyn bent down and pulled her into a hug. "And you, little one. You've won us all over, you know that?" Sophia laughed, hugging her grandmother as naturally as if she had been part of that family for a long time. Evelyn's acceptance brought unexpected relief and joy to everyone. The tension that had always seemed present before finally dissipated, allowing Alexander, Isabel, and Sophia to begin this new phase with total support. Among the guests, another figure stood out, Victoria Hart. She had come as a surprise to Alexander and Isabel, but her presence was warmly welcomed. Victoria seemed different, lighter, more serene. During the reception, she approached Alexander, who was chatting with Isabel and some friends. "Victoria," Alexander said, surprised but genuinely happy to see her. "Alexander, Isabel." Victoria smiled warmly. "I couldn't help but come to wish you both well." Isabel returned the smile, while Alexander looked slightly nervous. "Victoria, You don't have to say anything," she interrupted, waving her hand. "Everything's been sorted out, and honestly it was the best thing that could have happened." Alexander looked at her curiously, and Victoria smiled almost mischievously. "During that trip I took, I met someone who really understands me, who makes me laugh, and who makes me feel complete. I think I understand what you felt now, Alexander. It wasn't easy at first, but now I see that everything happened as it should." Alexander was genuinely relieved. He had always wished Victoria the best, and seeing her so radiant only reinforced that his decisions, however difficult, had brought everyone to where they needed to be. Later, Victoria introduced her boyfriend, a charming and kind man called Ethan, who joined the group of guests with ease. He seemed to be exactly what Victoria deserved, someone who loved her for who she was, without pressure or unrealistic expectations. When evening came and the garden lights began to twinkle like artificial stars, Alexander and Isabel opened the dance floor with a slow, meaningful waltz. Sophia watched with sparkling eyes, sitting next to Evelyn, who taught her the dance steps. Alexander looked at Isabel as they danced and whispered, "We're exactly where we should be, don't you think?" She smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "We were always meant to be, Alexander." The evening was filled with laughter, hugs, and promises of a future filled with love, not just for Alexander, Isabel, and Sophia, but for everyone around them. Evelyn had finally understood what was important. Victoria was walking her own path to happiness, and the new Whitmore family was beginning its happiest chapter. And at the center of it all, Alexander and Isabel danced, surrounded by those they loved, knowing that they had overcome their challenges and finally found what they had been looking for. A new beginning. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel to keep up with more content like this, and take the opportunity to watch the video that's appearing on your screen right now. I'm sure you'll love it. Thanks for being here, and see you next time.